Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the real vampires, not the Hollywood kind, but the documented cases that terrified entire villages and left archaeologists finding stakes through actual hearts. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready for some dark history and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to discover why every culture on Earth has been afraid of the same thing for thousands of years. In the winter of 1725, beneath the frozen earth of Kisilova, Imperial Provisor Frombald watches as the villagers' shovels strike wood. The sound echoes across the Serbian countryside like a death knell, hollow, final, wrong. Above them, storm clouds gather, pregnant with snow that will not fall. The village elder, Miloje, urges them deeper with trembling gestures. His breath forms ghosts in the bitter air, and his eyes hold the desperate faith of a man who has seen his world crack open to reveal something ancient and hungry lurking beneath. They have come to settle a matter that has stolen sleep from every household in Kisilova. For 40 days, Peter Blagojevich has been dead, buried with proper rites, blessed by the priest, committed to consecrated ground. Yet each night since his funeral, the dead man walks. His widow saw him first, a shadow at the foot of their bed, reaching for his shoes with fingers that should have been bones by now. When she screamed herself awake, she found only empty air and the lingering scent of grave earth. The next night brought his son's terrified account of a cold hand on his shoulder and whispered words of hunger from lips that had tasted dirt for more than a month. One by one, the villagers began to die. Strange deaths, bloodless deaths. They would speak of dreams before the end, of Peter visiting them in the darkness, of something drinking their strength away drop by drop. Within days, they would waste away, their life ebbing like water from a cracked vessel. The coffin lid splinters under the crowbars. Wood fragments scatter across the dark earth like broken bones. And there he lies. Peter Blagojevich rests in his grave as if he had been buried yesterday. His skin holds color that death should have stolen weeks ago. His fingernails have grown long and yellow. His beard has thickened. Fresh blood stains his lips and burial shroud. Blood that cannot be his own, for the dead do not bleed. But it is his eyes that make the villagers step back in horror. They are open, aware, staring up at the grey winter sky as if seeing something the living cannot. Frombald feels his official training desert him entirely. He has come from Vienna to investigate peasant superstitions, to bring Habsburg reason to Serbian folklore. Instead, he stares into a nightmare older than empires. The village elder raises his wooden stake, and the wind carries whispers of prayers older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than memory itself. This is how vampires were born, not in the imagination of novelists or the fever dreams of poets, but in the cold earth of village graveyards, in the desperate faith of people who knew that death was not always the end. But to understand Peter Blagojevich's refusal to remain dead, we must journey far deeper than his Serbian grave. We must travel back to humanity's first encounter with the mystery of death itself, to the moment when our ancestors first realized that consciousness ends and wondered if it truly does. The terror that grips the villagers of Kisilova in 1725 has roots that stretch back 5,000 years to the scorching desert of Egypt, where a civilization first emerged with an obsession that would shape human fear for millennia. The conviction that death is not the end, but a transformation. The Egyptians understood what modern morticians work desperately to hide, that death is not peaceful, not gentle, not final. It is violent, messy, and above all, uncertain. In the shadowy chambers beneath the pyramids, priests mumbled incantations over mummified bodies, their words echoing through corridors that smell of natron and decay. They knew something that chilled them to the bone. The dead do not always stay dead. The Egyptians spoke of two souls, the Ka and the Ba. The Ka is life force itself, the invisible twin that shadows every living person. When the body dies, the Ka lingers, hungry and lost, searching for sustenance. Without proper rituals, without the right offerings, it becomes something else, something that feeds on the living. The Ba is stranger still. It is the personality, the essence of who a person was, and it can take physical form. Ancient papyri describe the Ba as a human-headed bird that can return to the body, reanimate it, make it walk again. But if the body has been improperly preserved, if the rituals have been neglected, the Ba becomes a wanderer, eternally hungry, eternally seeking what it has lost. In tomb paintings, artists depict the Ba hovering over mummies, wings spread, beak open as if drinking something invisible from the wrapped corpse. The Egyptians understood what peasants in 18th century Serbia would rediscover. The dead have appetites that death cannot satisfy. The priest embalmers worked with desperate precision. They removed the brain through the nose, extracted the organs, packed the body with preserving salts. But their true purpose was not preservation. It was protection. They were building a fortress of ritual and chemistry to keep the dead where they belonged. Yet even with all their precautions, they failed. Egyptian texts speak of the Kaibitu, the shadows of the dead that escaped their tombs to prey upon the living. These were not metaphors. They were warnings etched in stone by people who had seen what happens when death goes wrong. While Egyptian priests struggled to contain their restless dead, further east between the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity's first great civilization grappled with spirits so malevolent that their names became curses whispered in the dark. The Galu were creatures of nightmare, demons who served Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. They were the spirits of those who died improperly, violently, or before their time. Unlike the Egyptian Ka, which merely hungered, the Galu actively hunted. They slipped through cracks in reality, emerging from the desert winds to drain the life from sleeping victims. Mesopotamian texts describe their feeding in clinical detail. The Galu attach themselves to a person's life force, drinking it slowly over weeks or months. Their victims waste away, growing pale and listless, complaining of vivid dreams where something crouches on their chest, stealing their breath. The symptoms are so specific, so consistent, that they mirror exactly what Peter Blagojevich's victims experienced in their final days, the gradual draining of life itself. But the Galu were not alone in the Mesopotamian darkness. The Udug were the ghosts of those who died without proper burial, their souls transformed into predatory spirits that fed on human warmth and vitality. They gathered in ruins and abandoned places, waiting for travelers foolish enough to sleep unprotected. The Babylonians developed elaborate rituals to ward them off. They buried their dead with food and drink, with clay tablets bearing protective spells, with amulets of iron and silver. They understood that death is a transition that can go catastrophically wrong, creating something that is neither living nor truly dead, something that remembers hunger. Ancient exorcism texts from Babylon read like field guides to spiritual parasites. They catalogued different types of the hungry dead, their feeding habits, their weaknesses. The Etemu were ghosts who died with unfinished business, returning to drain energy from their descendants. The Lilu were night demons who appeared as beautiful women, seducing men and leaving them empty husks by dawn. These were not primitive superstitions. They were careful observations recorded by civilizations sophisticated enough to build ziggurats and develop writing. This understanding of the hungry dead spread westward, where Greek thinkers transformed it into something even more terrifying, a philosophical problem as much as a spiritual one. The Greeks spoke of the psyche, the breath soul that gives life to the body. At death, This soul must journey to Hades, guided by Hermes' psychopomps across the river Styx. But the journey was treacherous, and not all souls completed it successfully. Greek burial customs revealed a civilization paralyzed by fear of the incomplete death. They placed coins on the eyes of corpses, payment for Charon, the ferryman who carries souls across the river of death. Without this payment, the soul remained trapped between worlds, unable to reach its final destination. But even proper burial offered no guarantee. Greek texts describe the vrikolakas, the restless dead who return when their journey to Hades fails. These were not the monstrous vampires of later folklore, but something more terrifying. Ordinary people who simply refused to stay dead. In the shadows of Greek mythology lurked creatures that prefigured the vampire by millennia. The Empusa appeared as beautiful women by night, luring travelers to lonely places where they fed on blood and life force. The Lamia were the transformed spirits of women who died in childbirth or lost their children, now forever hungry for what they could never have, life itself. These creatures shared a common origin. They were souls damaged by trauma, by loss, by the violent interruption of natural death. The Greeks recognized that the manner of dying shapes what the dead become. This recognition spread through the Roman Empire, where practical minds attempted to systematize the problem of the unquiet dead. Roman soldiers carried identification tags, not for military records, but to ensure their bodies would be claimed and properly buried. Roman law made it a crime to leave the dead unburied, punishable by exile or death. The Romans understood that unburied corpses create lemias, vengeful spirits that return to torment the living. The lemias appeared during the Lemuria, the festival of the restless dead, when the boundary between life and death grew thin. Roman heads of household performed protective rituals, walking barefoot through their homes at midnight, spitting black beans and banging bronze pots to drive away the hungry spirits. Their texts describe larvae, the malevolent ghosts of those who died young or violently, appearing to the living as pale, hollow-eyed figures who drained warmth and vitality from anyone they encountered. In the Celtic lands beyond Roman reach, similar fears took different forms. The Sluag were the unforgiven dead, souls of those who died without last rites or proper burial. They gathered in flocks like ravens, swooping down to steal the souls of the dying. Celtic warriors feared battlefield death not because they feared death itself, but because they feared dying far from home, where their bodies might lie unburied and their souls might join the restless host. Throughout all these civilizations, across all these cultures, one substance held power over life and death: blood. Not as metaphor, but as literal truth understood by peoples who watched animals bleed out, who saw human life flow away through wounds, who observed how blood loss brought weakness, pallor, and death. Blood was life made visible. When blood flowed out, life flowed out with it. When blood was lost, strength was lost. When blood stopped moving, consciousness stopped functioning. This understanding transformed blood into the most potent substance in the ancient world, a currency that could purchase life itself. Egyptian priests drank the blood of sacrificed animals to absorb their strength. Mesopotamian kings bathed in blood to maintain their vitality. But blood's power cut both ways. If blood could give life, then the loss of blood brought death. And if the dead hungered for what they had lost, they hungered for blood above all else. Ancient texts describe blood as the seat of the soul, the vessel that carries consciousness through the body. When blood was spilled, something essential was spilled with it, something that the dead remembered and craved. The connection between blood and the soul explains why the Galu, the Udug, the Lemurs, and all their kin were described as creatures that hungered specifically for blood, recognizing it as the essence of what they had lost. The fears that consumed these ancient civilizations were not abstract. In fields across Eastern Europe, archaeologists uncover graves that tell a story written in bone and iron. These are burials from the 6th to 8th centuries, the Dark Ages when Rome had fallen and new civilizations struggled to emerge from chaos. The skeletons lie in positions that suggest terror rather than peaceful rest. Stones have been placed in their mouths, heavy rocks on their chests, iron stakes through their hearts. These are not ceremonial burials or symbolic rituals. These are the graves of people who were buried alive or who were believed capable of returning from death. In Bulgaria, nearly 30% of the graves show signs of vampire burial, deliberate mutilation of corpses to prevent their return. Heads have been removed and placed between the legs. Limbs have been bound with iron chains. Hearts have been cut out and burned. The evidence suggests civilizations in the grip of vampire panics that lasted for centuries. These are not isolated incidents or the work of madmen. They represent systematic, community-wide efforts to keep the dead from walking. Similar graves appear across Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Something was happening in post-Roman Europe that convinced entire communities their dead were returning to feed on the living. The skeletons themselves tell a story modern science can read. Many show signs of tuberculosis, plague, or other wasting diseases that would have left their victims pale, blood-spitting, and slowly dying. The perfect candidates for vampire suspicion in communities where disease was poorly understood. But the most chilling graves are those of the children. Small skeletons buried with the same protective measures as adults, their tiny bones showing evidence of stakes and decapitation. These communities feared even their youngest dead. Ancient civilizations expressed their terror through architecture as much as ritual. The Great Pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the elaborate tombs of Greece and Rome, all represented attempts to create physical barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Egyptian tombs were designed as labyrinths with false passages, hidden chambers, and sealed doors that made it difficult for anything to find its way out. The burial chambers themselves were carved from solid stone, creating containers so secure that nothing inside could escape. Roman columbaria, vast underground cemeteries, functioned as cities of the dead, complete with streets, addresses, and neighborhoods. But they were also designed as prisons, with heavy doors, sealed passages, and walls thick enough to contain whatever might stir within. Greek and Roman communities buried their dead outside city walls, creating literal separation between the living community and the realm of the dead. The placement was not arbitrary. It represented the recognition that death is contagious, that the dead can influence the living through proximity alone. Now, as we stand with Imperial Provisor Frombold beside Peter Blagojevich's violated grave, we witness the culmination of fears that have haunted humanity for 5 millennia. The villagers of Kisilova carry in their hearts the same terror that drove Egyptian priests to mummify their dead, that inspired Mesopotamian exorcists to catalogue the hungry spirits, that led Greek philosophers to map the geography of the afterlife. The vampire is not a medieval invention or a Gothic fantasy. It is humanity's oldest nightmare, the recognition that death is not an ending, but a transformation, and that some transformations go wrong. Peter Blagojevich's open eyes reflect a truth that ancient civilizations discovered, and that modern skepticism has tried desperately to forget. Consciousness may be more persistent than flesh, and desire may outlast the body that feels it. The wooden stake rises in the elder's hands, carrying with it the weight of 5,000 years of human fear. In a moment, it will pierce the chest of a man who should have been at peace. The sound it makes, the wet final puncture of dead flesh, will echo across centuries, a percussion that beats in rhythm with humanity's most primal terror. Some hungers are stronger than death. Some needs outlast the bodies that need them. Some consciousness refuses the call of the grave. And in that refusal, in that desperate clinging to existence beyond existence, the vampire is born, not as monster, but as mirror, a reflection of what we fear most about ourselves, that we too might not know when to let go. The stake pierces flesh with a sound like tearing silk. Peter Blagojevich's body convulses once, then lies still. Fresh blood, impossible blood, wells up around the wooden point and flows across his burial shroud. The villagers of Kisilova step back, crossing themselves, but their eyes remain fixed on the corpse. They know this is not the end. This is barely the beginning. For what they have witnessed in their Serbian graveyard is the culmination of a story that began in the earliest nights of human civilization, when our ancestors first discovered that some hungers survive death itself. The creatures that stalked ancient dreams were not metaphors or symbols. They were specific, named entities with particular appetites and methods of feeding. They were the first vampires, though no one would use that word for centuries to come. In the sweltering nights of ancient Mesopotamia, when the wind carries sand across the ziggurats and oil lamps flicker in the darkness, mothers whisper warnings to their children about Lilitu. She is beautiful beyond description, with long, dark hair that flows like water and eyes that hold the depth of eternity. But beauty is her weapon, desire her trap. Lilitu appears to men in their dreams, and those dreams become nightmares that drain the life from sleeping bodies. The tablets of Babylon describe her feeding in detail that would make Peter Blagojevich's fate seem merciful. Lilitu does not simply kill, she consumes. She draws out not just blood, but breath, warmth, the very essence of vitality. Her victims waste away over weeks, growing pale and hollow-eyed, speaking of vivid dreams where a beautiful woman lies upon their chest, her lips pressed to their throat, drawing out their life in slow, ecstatic sips. But Lilitu is more than a predator. She is a punishment, a consequence of desire itself. The Mesopotamians understand that sexual appetite creates vulnerability, that longing opens doorways in the soul through which hungry things can enter. Lilitu feeds on that longing, transforms it into a spiritual wound that never heals. Men who survive her attention are forever changed, forever empty, searching for something they can never name but will never stop needing. The priests of Babylon develop elaborate protections against her. They carve amulets depicting her in chains, her power bound by words of command. They teach prayers that must be recited at sunset, when the boundary between day and night creates cracks in reality through which she might slip. But even these protections sometimes fail, because Lilitu understands something that the priests do not. She is not external to human nature, but embedded within it. She is desire itself, made manifest and given hunger. In the later Hebrew traditions, Lilitu becomes Lilith, the first wife of Adam, who refused to submit and was cast out of Eden to become queen of demons. The transformation reveals how vampire legends adapt and evolve, how each culture reshapes the hungry dead to reflect its own fears and taboos. But beneath the cultural variations, the essential nature remains constant. Beauty that conceals hunger, desire that leads to death, and the terrible recognition that what we want most might be what destroys us. While Mesopotamian scribes record their encounters with Lilitu, Greek storytellers develop their own pantheon of the beautiful dead. Lamia was once a queen of Libya, beloved of Zeus, mother to children who brought her joy beyond measure. But Hera's jealousy transforms love into loss, murdering Lamia's children and leaving her mad with grief. The transformation that follows is not magical, but psychological, a mother's love curdled into eternal hunger. Lamia becomes something that should not exist. a creature that appears as a beautiful woman but feeds on the young. She lures children with kindness and stories, then drains their blood while they sleep. Greek mothers tell their sons and daughters about Lamia not as entertainment, but as warning. The children who disappear, who are found pale and lifeless in their beds, have met something that remembers what it was like to love the young, and can no longer love anything without consuming it. The Greeks understand that Lamia represents the corruption of natural instincts. Maternal love becomes predatory hunger. The desire to nurture becomes the compulsion to consume. She is not evil by choice, but by damage, transformed by loss into something that can only take what it can no longer give. The tragedy of Lamia is not that she kills, but that she kills while trying to love. Her sister in hunger, Empusa, reveals another face of the feminine vampire. Where Lamia feeds on children, Empusa preys on adult men, appearing as the perfect woman to lonely travelers on dark roads. She offers what every man desires: beauty, passion, the promise of perfect union. But her gift is poisoned. Those who lie with Empusa wake to find themselves drained not just of blood, but of years. They age decades in a single night, their hair turning white, their skin becoming parchment, their strength flowing away like water through sand. Greek philosophers debate whether Empusa is real or metaphorical, but the question misses the point. She represents the recognition that desire itself can be vampiric, that the things we hunger for most intensely are often the things that destroy us most completely. The men who die from Empusa's embrace do not die from her feeding. They die from the intensity of their own wanting, from passions that burn through life faster than life can sustain them. Empusa appears most often to men who travel alone, who have separated themselves from community and family. The Greeks understand that isolation creates vulnerability, that those who live apart from human connection become prey to things that mimic connection while providing only consumption. She offers false intimacy, phantom love, the illusion of union that leaves her victims more alone than death itself. The vampire spreads eastward along trade routes, evolving with each culture it encounters. In China, the hungry dead take a different form entirely. The Jiangshi, the hopping corpse, reveals how cultural values shape the undead. Where Mediterranean vampires seduce and drain through beauty and desire, Chinese vampires are grotesque, rigid, animated by spiritual corruption rather than supernatural charisma. The Jiangshi is created when the soul fails to separate properly from the body at death. Instead of ascending to join the ancestors or reincarnating into new life, it remains trapped within rotting flesh, creating a being that is neither alive nor properly dead. The Jiangshi moves by hopping because death has stiffened its limbs beyond bending. It cannot see because its eyelids have sealed shut, so it hunts by sensing the breath of the living. It cannot speak because its tongue has swollen and darkened, but it can moan with a sound that freezes the blood of anyone who hears it. But the Jiangshi does not merely kill, it transforms. Its breath is poison that can animate other corpses, creating armies of the hopping dead. Chinese texts describe epidemics of Jiangshi spreading through villages like plague, turning graveyards into factories of undeath. The image is profoundly disturbing. Death itself becoming contagious, spreading from corpse to corpse, until entire communities become populated by the rigid dead. The Chinese develop specific protections against Jiangshi that reveal deep cultural anxieties about corruption and spiritual pollution. They scatter rice outside homes, knowing that Jiangshi cannot resist counting each grain, a compulsion that will keep them occupied until sunrise destroys them. They use mirrors to reflect spiritual energy back upon itself, creating barriers that the undead cannot cross. Most importantly, they burn incense and paper money, feeding the hungry ghosts with spiritual currency that might satisfy their needs without requiring human blood. These protections reveal the Chinese understanding that jiangshi are not merely predators, but victims, souls trapped in a condition they did not choose, hungry for release they cannot achieve. The hopping corpses represent the fear that death itself might be a kind of prison, that consciousness might persist in rotting flesh, aware but unable to escape, driven by needs that can never be satisfied. In India, the hungry dead take forms that are both more subtle and more terrifying than their Chinese counterparts. The Vitala are spirits that inhabit corpses, but unlike jiangshi, they retain full intelligence and supernatural cunning. They can speak, reason, even bargain with the living. This makes them infinitely more dangerous because they combine the hunger of the undead with the manipulation skills of the living. The Baital Pachisi, the famous collection of Vitala tales, presents these creatures as riddlers and storytellers, hanging upside down from trees like bats, engaging travelers in conversations that can last for hours. But beneath their intellectual facade lies an endless hunger for life force. They feed not through violence but through spiritual exhaustion, draining their victims through prolonged contact, leaving them empty husks who have forgotten how to want anything. The Vitala represents the most sophisticated understanding of vampirism in the ancient world. These creatures recognize that the most effective predation happens not through force, but through engagement. They offer what lonely travelers crave most: intelligent conversation, mental stimulation, the pleasure of solving puzzles and hearing stories. But this gift comes with a price. Each riddle answered, each story heard, each moment of engagement draws life away from the living and feeds it to the dead. Indian tradition also speaks of the churel, the spirits of women who died in childbirth, now doomed to wander the earth with their feet turned backward, their breasts hanging like empty sacks. The churel appears as a beautiful woman to men traveling alone at night, but her beauty is an illusion maintained by hunger. When she feeds, she reveals her true form, hollow, drained, forever mourning the life she lost and the child she could not save. The churel represents the feminine vampire at its most tragic. She does not kill from malice but from need, desperate to fill the emptiness that death has carved within her. She seduces men not from desire, but from the memory of desire, trying to recreate the intimacy that was stolen from her. Her victims die not from blood loss, but from the intensity of her need, drained by contact with grief so profound it has survived bodily death. Across the Malay Peninsula, vampire legends take an even more visceral form. The Penanggalan is perhaps the most disturbing of all vampiric entities. A detached head trailing bloody organs, the spirit of a woman who practiced black magic and was transformed by her own corruption. She feeds on the blood of pregnant women and newborn children, her long tongue lapping at wounds while her victims sleep. The Penanggalan represents vampirism stripped of all seduction and beauty, reduced to its essential nature. Hunger animated by hatred, need transformed into nightmare. She appears most often during childbirth, drawn by the scent of blood and new life. Malaysian women in labor surround themselves with thorny plants, knowing that the trailing organs of the Penanggalan will become entangled in the spikes, trapping the creature until dawn destroys her. But perhaps the most widespread of the feminine vampires emerges from the Philippines, where the aswang represents not one creature, but an entire category of shape-shifting predators. The aswang can appear as human, dog, bird, or pig, but its true nature is always revealed by its feeding habits. It prefers the blood of children and pregnant women, but unlike other vampires, it does not merely drain, it devours entirely, leaving behind only empty clothes and the lingering scent of decay. The aswang reveals how vampire legends adapt to different environments and survival needs. In island communities where resources are scarce and child mortality is high, the vampire becomes not just a blood drinker, but a consumer of the young, representing the fear that something might be actively hunting the next generation. The shape-shifting ability reflects the paranoia of small communities where anyone might be the predator, where trust becomes a luxury that can prove fatal. These ancient vampires share common characteristics that transcend cultural boundaries. They appear most often at liminal times: sunset, midnight, dawn, when the boundary between day and night creates opportunities for crossing between worlds. They target the vulnerable, travelers, children, pregnant women, the isolated and alone. They offer what their victims desire most: beauty, love, conversation, comfort, but transform these gifts into weapons of consumption. Most importantly, they represent the recognition that desire itself can be vampiric. The hunger for beauty, for love, for connection, for meaning. These fundamental human needs create openings in the soul, through which predatory forces can enter. The ancient vampires are not external threats, but internal ones, manifestations of the truth that what we want most intensely is often what destroys us most completely. In the archaeological record, we find evidence that these creatures were more than stories. Graves across Eastern Europe reveal skeletons with iron stakes through their hearts, stones in their mouths, limbs bound with chains. These are not symbolic burials, but practical ones, the graves of people who were believed to have become vampires and needed to be prevented from rising. The bones tell their own story. Many show signs of tuberculosis, plague, or other wasting diseases that would have left their victims displaying classic vampire symptoms: pale skin, sensitivity to light, coughing up blood, growing progressively weaker over time. In communities where disease was poorly understood, these symptoms would have seemed supernatural, evidence of spiritual corruption rather than medical condition. But the most revealing graves are those found in remote locations, far from established cemeteries. These are the resting places of the truly feared. People who were not just suspected vampires, but confirmed ones. Individuals who had been seen returning from death to feed on the living. Their graves are not just protective, but punitive, designed not just to keep them down, but to ensure they suffer in their confinement. The iron stakes through their hearts were not meant to kill. The occupants were already dead. They were meant to pin the soul to the body, preventing the spiritual separation that would allow vampiric return. The stones in their mouths were placed to prevent feeding, to deny them the ability to consume blood, even if they managed to rise. The chains around their limbs were insurance against the possibility that death itself might not be strong enough to hold them. These graves represent the culmination of thousands of years of vampire fear, the practical application of knowledge passed down through generations of storytellers, priests, and survivors. They are the final chapters in stories that began with Lilitu in Babylon, continued through Lamia in Greece, and reached their inevitable conclusion in the earth of medieval Europe. As we stand in the cemetery of Kisilova, watching Peter Blagojevich's blood flow around the wooden stake, we witness the end of one vampire, but not the end of vampirism itself. The ancient creatures that stalked Mesopotamian dreams and Greek nightmares have not disappeared. They have evolved, adapted, learned to hide in new forms and feed through new methods. The blood that stains the burial shroud carries within it the genetic memory of every vampire that came before, every hungry spirit that refused to accept death as final, every consciousness that chose consumption over rest. Peter Blagojevich is not the first to rise from his grave, and the villagers of Kisilova know, even as they drive their stake home, that he will not be the last. The ancient world gave birth to vampires, not as monsters, but as mirrors, reflections of the deepest human fears about desire, death, and the possibility that consciousness might be stronger than flesh. These first vampires establish patterns that persist to this day. The beautiful predator, the seductive killer, the hunger that can never be satisfied. the recognition that what we want most might be what destroys us. In the darkness gathering around the Serbian graveyard, as the villagers pack earth back into Peter Blagojević's grave, these ancient spirits watch and wait. They have learned patience across millennia, learned to hide behind familiar faces, learned to offer what the living crave most desperately. They are the first vampires, and they are still among us, still feeding, still transforming human desire into supernatural hunger. The stake may have pierced one heart, but the hunger it represents is immortal, passed down through bloodlines of story and nightmare, waiting for the next lonely traveler, the next isolated dreamer, the next soul foolish enough to believe that some desires are worth dying for. The earth settles back into place over Peter Blagojević's violated grave with a sound like a sigh. The villagers of Kisilova pack the dirt with their boots, each footfall a prayer that this time, death will hold. But their faces carry no relief, only the grim satisfaction of soldiers who have won a single battle in a war that has been raging for centuries. For in the mountains and valleys of Eastern Europe, the dead have been walking with increasing boldness. What the villagers of Kisilova have witnessed is not an aberration, but an epidemic. A plague of the unquiet dead that spreads from graveyard to graveyard like fire through dry grass. Peter Blagojević is merely one among hundreds. His resurrection part of a pattern that has transformed the Balkans into a hunting ground, where the living must constantly guard against those who refuse to remain buried. In the shadow-haunted valleys of Wallachia, shepherds returning from the high pastures speak of encounters that freeze the blood in their veins. They tell of meeting neighbors on mountain paths, people they buried with their own hands weeks or months before, walking with the peculiar stiffness of those whose joints have forgotten the rhythm of life. These Strigoi move through the darkness with purpose that should not exist in the dead, their eyes holding a hunger that makes wolves seem tame by comparison. The Strigoi are not like the ancient spirits of distant lands. They are immediate, personal, intimate in their horror. They are the farmer who hanged himself in his barn during the famine of 1718, now walking through villages seeking sustenance the earth cannot provide. They are the mother who died in childbirth, returning to steal the breath from sleeping infants because death has not diminished her need to nurture, only corrupted it beyond recognition. They are the young man who fell from his horse and broke his neck, his unfulfilled desires too strong for the grave to contain. The people of Wallachia know these creatures intimately because they once knew them as family, as friends, as lovers. The horror of the Strigoi lies not in their alien nature, but in their terrible familiarity. When a mother finds her dead child standing at the foot of her bed, asking why she has forgotten to prepare his evening meal, the terror comes not from encountering a monster, but from recognizing love, transformed into something that can only consume. Across the mountains in Serbia, the vampire take different forms, but serve the same hunger. Serbian villagers whisper of the dead, who hunt in packs, drawn together by shared appetite, like scavengers gathering around carrion. These creatures retain their human intelligence, but apply it to purposes that mock their former humanity. They plan their attacks with the cunning of generals commanding campaigns, coordinate their movements with the precision of merchants organizing trade, and pursue their prey with the patience of farmers waiting for harvest. The vampire of Serbia are strategists of the supernatural, creatures who understand that the most effective predation happens through deception rather than force. They appear at village gatherings as concerned neighbors, at family celebrations as beloved relatives, at religious ceremonies as faithful worshippers. Only when they have re-established their place in the community do they begin to feed, slowly and carefully, ensuring that their consumption appears as natural death rather than supernatural predation. In the Greek islands, where ancient traditions run deeper than the roots of olive trees, the Vrikolakas have evolved into something even more disturbing. These creatures do not merely feed on individuals, but corrupt entire communities, transforming peaceful villages into nurseries of the undead through spiritual contamination that spreads like plague through a population already weakened by proximity to death. The Vrykolikas begins as a single corrupted corpse, but its influence radiates outward like ripples in still water. Its presence makes death itself unreliable, causing other graves to become restless, other corpses to stir with unnatural life. The boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable, creating conditions where resurrection requires no special circumstances, where any death might become the beginning of a different kind of existence. These creatures multiply through the same mechanisms that spread disease: contact, proximity, the sharing of food and space and breath. But unlike disease, which weakens and kills, the infection of the Vrykolikas transforms its victims into something that appears stronger, more vital, more alive than they were before death claimed them. The horror lies in recognizing that this apparent improvement serves appetites that have nothing to do with life as the living understand it. The winter of 1725 brings the case that will echo through the official records of the Austrian Empire and establish the undead as matters of imperial concern. In the village of Medvedja, where snow lies thick enough to muffle the sound of digging, Arnold Paule returns from military service carrying wounds that are not visible to the eye. He speaks little of his experiences in the Ottoman territories, but his wife notices that he no longer sleeps peacefully, that he startles at shadows, that he sometimes stares at his own reflection as if seeing a stranger. Paule's death comes suddenly. A fall from his wagon that breaks his neck with the sound of snapping wood. His funeral follows proper Orthodox traditions, his body blessed and committed to consecrated ground, while his widow weeps with the grief of the truly bereft. The village settles into the familiar rhythm of mourning, the gradual acceptance of loss that allows communities to continue despite the constant presence of death. But 3 weeks after the funeral, Paule's widow wakes to find her dead husband standing beside their bed, still wearing the clothes he was buried in, still bearing the earth of his grave in his hair and under his fingernails. He speaks to her in his own voice, asking why she grieves when he has returned to comfort her. When she screams, he does not flee or fade, but simply steps back into the shadows, his presence lingering like the scent of turned earth long after his form has disappeared. The pattern that follows has become familiar to anyone who has lived through such visitations. Paule appears to other villagers, always at night, always speaking of needs that death should have ended, but has somehow intensified. His victims, for that is what they become, though the word is never spoken aloud, begin to display the signs that mark contact with the hungry dead. They grow pale and listless, complain of dreams that feel more real than waking, describe a persistent weakness that no amount of rest can cure. Within a month, 4 villagers have died of what physicians call natural causes, but what older residents recognize as the slow consumption that follows supernatural visitation. The deaths follow bloodlines and marriage bonds, striking those closest to Paule in life, as if his affection has become a form of predation that targets love itself. The village elders know what must be done, but they also know that the world has changed since their grandparents' time. The Austrian Empire demands documentation for unusual events, explanations that fit within official categories of understanding. The simple act of destroying a dangerous corpse becomes a bureaucratic challenge requiring military observers, written reports, and justifications that translate supernatural necessity into administrative language. Provisor Frombold arrives from Belgrade with the skepticism of an educated man and the thoroughness of an imperial bureaucrat. He has come to investigate peasant superstitions and document the ignorance that still flourishes in the empire's remote provinces. But when the villagers open Arnold Paule's grave, Frombold finds himself confronting evidence that his Viennese education has not prepared him to process. Paule lies in his coffin as if sleep rather than death has claimed him. His body shows none of the decay that 6 weeks in winter ground should have produced. His skin retains the flush of life, His hair and nails show signs of recent growth, and when the villagers turn him onto his side, fresh blood flows from his mouth like a spring being uncapped. Most disturbing of all, his eyes are open and aware, tracking the movements of the living, with an intelligence that should have been extinguished weeks ago. The destruction of Arnold Paoli follows protocols that are older than writing, ceremonies that have been passed down through generations of those who understand that some deaths require active completion. The wooden stake that pierces his heart is not driven by superstition, but by practical necessity. The recognition that consciousness, which refuses natural termination, must be forcibly separated from the flesh that sustains it. But Paoli's destruction does not end the dying. Through the spring and summer of 1726, the epidemic spreads through Medvedja like fire through a forest prepared by drought. 17 people die of the same wasting illness, their deaths following the same pattern of gradual consumption that marked Paul's initial victims. The Austrian authorities find themselves forced to acknowledge that whatever force animated the dead soldier has proven capable of reproduction, creating new centers of infection that spread the condition beyond its original source. The second investigation, conducted in the winter of 1727, becomes a systematic study of how the dead feed on the living and how that feeding creates more dead. 5 more graves are opened, 5 more impossibly preserved corpses are found. 5 more stakings are performed while imperial observers document phenomena that challenge every assumption about the nature of death and consciousness. The Paul case establishes patterns that repeat across the Balkans with the reliability of natural law. The creatures that return from death retain enough humanity to target those they knew in life, but their human emotions have been transformed into alien appetites that serve needs incomprehensible to the living. Love becomes a form of hunting, family bonds become feeding channels, and intimate relationships become the mechanisms through which the dead consume the living. The Habsburg military files fill with similar reports from across their Balkan territories. Each case follows the same progression: unusual death, improper burial or delayed decomposition, nighttime visitations, gradual weakening of those visited, eventual deaths that create new centers of infection. The pattern is so consistent that military commanders begin treating undead outbreaks as public health emergencies requiring immediate intervention. But the most disturbing aspect of these epidemics lies in their social dimension. The hungry dead do not attack random victims, but focus their attention on family members, close friends, and intimate associates. They exploit the very relationships that give life meaning, transforming love into a vulnerability that predators can manipulate. The mother who cannot refuse her dead child's request for nourishment. The widow who cannot turn away her husband's midnight visits. The brother who cannot deny his sibling's need for comfort. All become accomplices in their own consumption. The religious dimensions of the crisis create additional complications that threaten to tear communities apart. Orthodox burial practices, designed to prepare the dead for eventual resurrection, preserve bodies in conditions that seem to encourage undead animation. Catholic authorities point to the Orthodox cemetery full of preserved corpses as evidence of theological error, while Orthodox leaders respond that Catholic emphasis on rapid decomposition shows disrespect for the body's sacred nature. These religious disputes might seem academic, but they have practical consequences when communities must decide how to bury their dead in ways that prevent resurrection. Mixed villages find themselves paralyzed by competing burial traditions, unable to agree on procedures that might prevent the creation of new undead. The result is often compromise solutions that satisfy neither tradition while providing protection according to neither doctrine. The social upheaval that accompanies these supernatural epidemics reveals how fear of the dead can tear apart the fabric of community life. Neighbors begin to view each other with suspicion, watching for signs of supernatural influence. interpreting ordinary illnesses as evidence of undead predation. Families divide over whether to exhume and examine questionable deaths. Villages split between those who insist on traditional protective measures and those who prefer modern medical explanations. The economic impact proves equally destructive. Communities facing undead epidemics often see their agricultural productivity collapse as farmers abandon fields that lie too close to active cemeteries. Trade relationships dissolve when merchants refuse to enter areas known to harbour the unquiet dead. Property values plummet when houses acquire reputations for supernatural visitation. The purely practical consequences of believing in the undead create material hardships that persist long after the spiritual crisis has been resolved. Yet beneath the social disruption and economic chaos lies a more fundamental crisis of meaning. The communities that face undead epidemics must confront the possibility that their most basic assumptions about death, consciousness, and the nature of human existence might be wrong. The idea that death provides final resolution to life's struggles, that burial ends human story, that the grave provides rest for both the dead and the living. All of these comforting certainties crumble when faced with evidence that some stories refuse to end. The professional vampire hunters who emerge from this crisis represent a new category of spiritual specialist, individuals who combine traditional knowledge with practical experience to develop systematic methods for dealing with the hungry dead. These dhampirs or vampirovich operate according to principles that blend folk wisdom with proto-scientific observation, treating undead phenomena as natural occurrences requiring technical expertise rather than religious intervention. The dhampirs develop diagnostic techniques for identifying different types of undead, therapeutic procedures for protecting communities from supernatural attack, and preventive measures for reducing the likelihood of post-mortem animation. Their methods vary by region and tradition, but they share a common understanding that the hungry dead represent a category of consciousness that operates according to discoverable principles and responds to specific interventions. These specialists travel from village to village like physicians making rounds, offering their services to communities that can afford their fees and possess the courage to acknowledge their need. Their success rates vary, but their mere existence provides hope to populations that might otherwise face undead epidemics with only prayer and desperation as protection. The knowledge accumulated by the dhampirs reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between manner of death and likelihood of resurrection, between burial practices and post-mortem preservation, between family dynamics and patterns of supernatural predation. They recognize that certain types of people, those who die with strong unfulfilled desires, those whose deaths violate natural order, those whose burials fail to follow proper procedures, present elevated risk for undead animation. More importantly, they understand that the hungry dead are not random forces of supernatural chaos, but consciousness operating according to alien but discoverable logic. The undead retain enough humanity to be predictable in their behavior, vulnerable to specific interventions, and capable of being reasoned with under certain circumstances. This insight transforms vampire hunting from desperate struggle against incomprehensible monsters into technical work, requiring specialized knowledge and careful application of proven methods. The documentation of these cases by Austrian military authorities creates an unprecedented archive of supernatural phenomena recorded by trained observers and preserved in official records. For the first time in human history, encounters with the hungry dead are studied systematically, analyzed scientifically, and documented bureaucratically. The result is evidence that the undead exist not merely in folklore and superstition, but in the daylight world of government reports and military files. Yet the more carefully these phenomena are studied, the more mysterious they become. The Austrian investigators approach undead cases with military precision and bureaucratic thoroughness, but their detailed observations only deepen the questions they were sent to resolve. The evidence they collect supports the reality of supernatural predation, while failing to explain how such predation is possible within the natural order they understand. This paradox creates its own form of horror, the recognition that rational investigation of irrational phenomena leads not to resolution but to deeper mystery. The military observers who document undead cases return to Vienna with reports that challenge everything their education has taught them about death, consciousness, and the boundaries of the possible. They have been trained to impose order on chaos, but their encounter with the hungry dead reveals chaos that refuses to be ordered, mystery that grows more mysterious the more light is shed upon it. The epidemic nature of Balkan undead activity suggests that something fundamental changed in the relationship between life and death during the early 18th century. Whether this change represents the breakdown of traditional protective practices, the emergence of new forms of spiritual predation, or the increased documentation of phenomena that had always existed, the result is the same. The hungry dead become historical actors rather than merely folkloric possibilities. The cases documented in Habsburg military files established that the undead operate according to natural laws that human understanding has not yet grasped. They demonstrate patterns of behavior, methods of reproduction, and vulnerabilities to specific interventions that suggest they represent a category of existence that science has not yet learned to study properly. They are neither supernatural in the sense of violating natural law, nor natural in the sense of fitting within current scientific understanding. As night falls over the cemetery of Kisilova, where Peter Blagojevich's grave has finally found peace under the weight of earth and prayer, the larger epidemic continues to spread through the valleys and mountains of Eastern Europe. His destruction represents not victory over the forces of undeath, but merely successful containment of a single outbreak in a conflict that shows no signs of ending. The hungry dead have learned to walk among the living with unprecedented boldness, to hunt with systematic efficiency, and to reproduce their condition through methods that transform victims into predators. They have evolved beyond their ancient origins, becoming something new and terrible, not merely folkloric monsters, but documented predators that operate according to discoverable principles, while serving appetites that remain fundamentally alien to human understanding. The Strigoi, vampire, and vrokolakas continue to multiply in the darkness between villages, driven by hungers that no amount of feeding can satisfy, animated by consciousness that refuses the natural termination of death. They represent the emergence of predatory intelligence that has learned to exploit the very bonds that hold human communities together, transforming love into vulnerability, family into feeding ground, and death itself into a beginning rather than an end. The earth over Peter Blagojevich's grave has barely settled when his story begins to travel westward like plague carried by merchant ships. The Austrian reports documenting his exhumation move along trade routes that connect the Balkans to the coffee houses of Vienna, the salons of Paris, the gaslit drawing rooms of London. What began as a local terror, one village's desperate struggle with their restless dead, becomes something far more dangerous, a seed of inspiration that will bloom into nightmares the world has never seen. In the libraries of Western Europe, scholars read these Balkan reports by candlelight, their educated minds recoiling from accounts that challenge everything the age of reason claims to understand. Yet the documents arrive, bearing imperial seals signed by military officers, witnessed by government officials, whose reliability cannot be dismissed as peasant superstition. The collision between rational skepticism and documented impossibility creates a hunger of its own, a desperate need to transform these uncomfortable truths into something more palatable, more distant, more safely contained within the boundaries of fiction. The transformation begins in the shadows of Gothic literature, where writers have already learned to walk the knife's edge between reason and madness. But the undead of Balkan folklore offer something that earlier Gothic fiction could never provide: monsters that are simultaneously exotic and intimate, documented and impossible, foreign enough to thrill, but real enough to terrify. They are not metaphors or symbols, but specific entities with particular hungers, creatures whose existence has been verified by men with uniforms and official titles. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu understands this potential with the instincts of a predator recognizing prey. His pale, aristocratic Carmilla emerges from the drawing rooms of Styria like a fever dream of repressed Victorian desire, but her roots drink deep from the same soil that nourished the crude Strigoi of Eastern European graveyards. Le Fanu takes the shapeless hunger that drove peasant revenants from their graves and gives it form, intelligence, and above all, seductive power. Carmilla Karnstein is what the village dead might become if they possessed centuries to refine their appetites, aristocratic resources to support their existence, and noble breeding to disguise their true nature. She does not shamble through graveyards seeking random victims, but glides through society, cultivating relationships, establishing emotional bonds, transforming the act of feeding into an expression of passionate love. Her victims do not flee her presence, but seek it out, interpreting the gradual drain of their life force as the intensity of romantic connection. The Countess represents a new evolution in predatory consciousness, the recognition that the most effective hunting happens through seduction rather than violence, through offering what victims most desire, rather than simply taking what predators need. Carmilla's feeding becomes a form of spiritual intimacy, her bite a kiss that her victims remember with longing, even as it slowly kills them. She proves that the hungry dead need not remain crude monsters, but can evolve into sophisticated predators whose very refinement makes them more dangerous than their primitive ancestors. But it is Bram Stoker who will complete the transformation of Balkan folklore into something that will haunt the world's imagination for centuries to come. Stoker approaches his creation with the obsessive thoroughness of a man building not merely a story, but a mythology. His notebooks reveal years of careful research, methodical collection of folklore, systematic study of traditions that most educated men dismiss as superstition. He reads travel accounts, interviews immigrants, corresponds with scholars, all in service of creating a monster that will feel absolutely real, despite being entirely fictional. In Emily Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest, Stoker discovers the key that will unlock his masterpiece. Gerard writes about Transylvania with the precise fascination of an anthropologist cataloguing the beliefs of a people who still live in the shadow of the supernatural. She describes the Nosferatu, the not dead of Romanian tradition, not as quaint folklore, but as living reality for communities that have learned to coexist with forces beyond rational understanding. Gerard's pages introduce Stoker to a world where the dead walk with the casual familiarity that others reserve for discussing weather. She writes of the Moroi, living people born with supernatural abilities who become powerful revenants after death. She documents the Strigoi, ordinary dead who return due to improper burial or violent death. Most importantly, she describes the Nosferatu, ancient revenants who have developed supernatural powers through centuries of existence, becoming something that transcends both human and inhuman classification. But Gerard's most precious gift to Stoker is her account of Vlad III of Wallachia, the historical figure known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. Here Stoker finds the perfect fusion of documented historical brutality and folkloric supernatural power. Vlad III was a real ruler whose methods of maintaining power were so horrific that they shocked even his contemporaries. But he is also a figure who has begun transforming into legend within the oral traditions of his former subjects. The historical Vlad ruled through terror so systematic that it became a form of art. He earned his nickname through his preferred method of execution, impaling enemies on wooden stakes and arranging them in forests of the dying that could be seen for miles. European chronicles describe him dining among fields of impaled corpses, conducting business while surrounded by the screams of those dying slowly on his orders, transforming political opposition into literal torture spectacle. But the peasant stories of Wallachia remember him as something more than merely cruel. In their whispered accounts, Vlad's brutality serves supernatural purposes. He feeds on suffering as much as blood, draws power from the agony of his victims, maintains his strength through constant contact with death itself. The historical figure becomes a template for understanding how human evil might survive bodily death, how political ruthlessness might transform into otherworldly predation. Stoker's genius lies in recognizing that the most effective monsters are those that combine realistic human evil with supernatural amplification. His Count Dracula emerges from the marriage of documented historical brutality and carefully researched folkloric tradition. He possesses the strategic intelligence of a successful military commander, the refined tastes of centuries-old aristocracy, and the patient cunning of someone who has had lifetimes to perfect his predatory methods. The Count embodies fears that grip Victorian England like a fever. He arrives in London not as an invading army, but as an immigrant, using legal channels and commercial networks to establish himself within British society. He purchases property through solicitors, travels on commercial ships, adapts to urban environments with the ease of someone who has survived by learning to change with changing times. He represents the nightmare of the exotic predator who appears civilized, refined, even admirable, while secretly working to transform the heart of civilization into something alien and hostile. Dracula succeeds where earlier Gothic villains failed because he grounds supernatural horror in contemporary anxiety. He is not safely distant in time or place, but actively present in gaslit London, riding in handsome cabs, conducting business through proper channels, adapting ancient predatory methods to modern urban environment. He proves that globalization creates new vulnerabilities, that improved transportation and communication allow threats to travel further and faster than ever before. The novel's structure mirrors the panic that grips communities facing real undead epidemics. Dracula begins as a single predator confined to his remote castle, but his influence expands with geometric progression throughout the narrative. First, Jonathan Harker becomes his prisoner and potential victim. Then Mina and Lucy become targets of his feeding. Finally, through Lucy's transformation and Renfield's madness, his corruption begins spreading through London's social networks like spiritual disease. Stoker understands that the most terrifying aspect of the Hungry Dead is not their supernatural powers, but their ability to reproduce their condition, to transform victims into predators who will create new victims in turn. The Count does not merely kill, but converts, not merely feeds, but breeds, creating networks of dependency that can spread exponentially through populations that have no natural defenses against such predation. The novel's treatment of blood reflects medical knowledge that makes supernatural feeding seem like logical extension of emerging scientific understanding. Stoker writes during the early years of blood transfusion, when physicians are beginning to understand blood's role in maintaining life, but have not yet grasped the complexities of compatibility and rejection. The idea that life force can be transferred through blood exchange seems not supernatural, but proto-scientific, a reasonable hypothesis based on incomplete but suggestive evidence. Dracula's feeding method, the exchange of blood between predator and victim, mirrors contemporary understanding of how diseases propagate through populations. The Count's victims do not simply die, but become infected, their conditions spreading to others through intimate contact. The supernatural becomes epidemiological, the folkloric becomes medical, and the impossible becomes merely improbable. The sexual undertones of the Count's feeding reflect tensions that grip Victorian society like hidden fever. His victims experience his attention as simultaneously terrifying and ecstatic, describing his feeding in language that borders on the erotic. They find themselves drawn to encounters that they consciously fear. seeking out experiences that they intellectually recognize as destructive. The Count offers what his victims desire most intensely, while providing what they can least afford to lose. This psychological sophistication transforms the undead from simple predator into complex relationship. Dracula's victims are not random prey, but carefully selected partners in interactions that appear consensual while being fundamentally exploitative. The Count understands that the most effective predation occurs when victims collaborate in their own consumption, when feeding becomes a form of intimacy that victims interpret as love. The novel's geography reflects imperial anxieties about the relationship between civilized center and barbarous periphery. The story begins in Transylvania, presented as a region where ancient barbarities persist unchanged by centuries of supposed progress, but concludes in London, the supposed center of civilization and rational advancement. The Count's journey from periphery to center represents the nightmare possibility that civilization might be more fragile than its defenders believe, that the forces of darkness might adapt to modern conditions more successfully than the forces of light. Van Helsing and his allies represent rational, scientific response to supernatural threat, but their success depends not on choosing between modern technology and ancient tradition, but on synthesizing both into hybrid methodology. They use telegraphs and typewriters to coordinate their campaign, but they also employ crucifixes, holy water, and wooden stakes. Their victory proves that the most effective defense against sophisticated predators requires combining the best insights from all available sources of knowledge. Stoker's most lasting achievement lies in creating the aristocratic undead as literary archetype that will influence popular culture for centuries to come. Previous folklore presented revenants as peasant figures driven by simple hungers and basic needs. Count Dracula is something entirely different. A sophisticated predator whose centuries of existence have refined his methods into high art, who possesses resources and knowledge that make him more dangerous than any mere monster. The Count represents the democratization of aristocratic corruption, the recognition that in an age of global communication and rapid transportation, the predatory methods once confined to remote castles and isolated communities can be exported anywhere, adapted to any environment, refined to target any population. He is the perfect monster for an interconnected world, a predator whose sophistication allows him to exploit the very networks that supposedly bind civilization together. But perhaps Stoker's most profound insight lies in his revelation of the undead condition as tragic, rather than merely evil. The Count's dialogue reveals someone who remembers what it was like to be human, but can no longer access human emotion except as predatory tool. He speaks of love, honor, and loyalty with the clinical precision of someone analyzing foreign concepts. He understands human motivation intellectually, but cannot feel it experientially, making him simultaneously more and less than human. This psychological complexity transforms the hungry dead from external threat into internal tragedy. Dracula is not evil by nature, but by choice, not damned by cosmic justice, but by personal decision. He represents the logical conclusion of human ambition, unrestrained by human limitation, the pursuit of power and longevity beyond the boundaries that define meaningful existence. He has gained everything that mortality fears to lose, while losing everything that makes mortality worth preserving. The novel becomes a meditation on the price of transcending human limitations. The Count has achieved immortality, supernatural power, and freedom from the physical constraints that bind ordinary existence. But he has paid for these gifts with the loss of everything that makes life worth living: love, friendship, growth, change, the possibility of genuine surprise or authentic emotion. He exists in a state of eternal hunger that no amount of feeding can satisfy, pursuing needs that can never be fulfilled because fulfillment would eliminate the appetite that sustains his existence. Stoker's Dracula succeeds because it transforms local folklore into universal mythology. The Strigoi and Nosferatu of Romanian tradition become templates for understanding how evil adapts and spreads, how traditional threats assume modern forms, how the most dangerous predators are those who appear most civilized. The Count provides a framework for comprehending predatory relationships that operate through seduction rather than force, that corrupt from within rather than attacking from without, that transform victims into accomplices in their own destruction. The novel's impact extends far beyond literature into popular consciousness, becoming shorthand for understanding how corruption spreads through social networks, how traditional communities become vulnerable to external influence, how globalization creates new forms of predation that combine ancient appetites with modern methods. Dracula becomes not merely a fictional character, but a diagnostic tool for recognizing sophisticated forms of exploitation that wear civilized masks. As we return to the cemetery of Kisilova, where Peter Blagojevich's grave has become peaceful under the weight of earth and time, we can trace the direct line connecting his documented resurrection to Stoker's fictional Count. The same fears that drove Serbian villagers to stake their restless dead find expression in Victorian London's terror of foreign contamination. The same recognition that death might not be final, that evil might persist beyond bodily existence, that desire itself might be a form of predation. These insights travel from Balkan folklore through imperial documentation into global literature. Count Dracula represents the culmination of humanity's long struggle to understand the hungry dead. He embodies thousands of years of accumulated fear, refined through centuries of storytelling, documented through decades of bureaucratic investigation, and finally transformed into literary archetype that captures not just supernatural terror, but social anxiety. He is Peter Blagojevich, elevated to aristocratic status, the village revenant granted global reach, the local monster transformed into universal threat. The Count's castle in Transylvania stands as monument to this transformation, a fortress where ancient hunger adapts modern methods, where folkloric tradition meets imperial ambition, where the hungry dead of village cemeteries evolve into sophisticated predators capable of hunting anywhere civilization has spread its networks. In Dracula's halls, the undead finally transcend their origins as crude revenants to become something far more dangerous, mirrors that reflect the predatory potential lurking within civilized humanity itself. Count Dracula has barely finished stalking through the gaslit streets of London when the men in white coats arrive to dissect him. They come with scalpels instead of stakes, with notebooks instead of prayers, with the cold confidence of those who believe that light cast by reason can illuminate any darkness. In the morgues and medical schools of late Victorian Europe, a new kind of hunter emerges. Physicians who stalk the undead not through moonlit cemeteries, but through the methodical corridors of scientific inquiry. Dr. Johann Flückiger pulls back the burial shroud from what the peasants of Medvedja call a Nosferatu, and sees only decomposing flesh following the natural laws of decay. The supernatural preservation that terrified village elders reveals itself under his trained eye as nothing more than cold soil and sealed coffins slowing the inevitable processes of putrefaction. The fresh blood that seemed to flow from staked hearts proves to be decomposition fluid, darkened by chemical changes that occur in all rotting meat. Flückiger writes his reports by lamplight, his pen scratching across official forms that will file away centuries of terror under the neat categories of medical science. But even as he documents the rational explanations, something troubles him. A nagging recognition that his scientific understanding, while accurate, fails to account for the specificity of the community's fears, the precision of their protective rituals, the apparent effectiveness of their ancient remedies. In the gaslit wards of London's consumption hospitals, Dr. William Whitman walks among patients who display the classic signs that folklore attributes to supernatural predation. They are pale as moonlight, sensitive to bright illumination, coughing blood that stains their nightclothes like evidence of feeding. They waste away slowly, their life ebbing like water from a cracked vessel, while their families watch helplessly from bedside vigils that mirror the hopeless watches kept by those who believe their loved ones are being drained by the hungry dead. Whitman understands what the village wise women could not, that the symptoms attributed to nocturnal visitation by blood-drinking revenants match precisely the progression of tuberculosis, the White Death that stalks through European cities like a slow-moving plague. The night sweats, the gradual weakness, the way the disease spreads through families who share homes and breath and intimate contact, all of it corresponds to bacterial infection, rather than supernatural predation. But understanding the mechanism does not diminish the horror. If anything, the medical reality proves more disturbing than the folkloric explanation. The idea of microscopic predators feeding on human tissue, invisible creatures that hunt through the very air that sustains life, entities too small to see yet capable of consuming entire families. This scientific truth makes the old stories of blood-drinking revenants seem almost comforting by comparison. In the private practice of Dr. David Dolphin, patients arrive with symptoms that would have marked them as creatures of darkness in earlier centuries. They suffer from extreme sensitivity to sunlight that causes painful blistering, severe anemia that creates deathly pallor, and psychological disturbances that can include violent behavior and apparent madness. Their gums recede, making their teeth appear elongated into fang-like projections that catch the light like ivory daggers. Dolphin has given a name to their condition, porphyria, a disorder of blood chemistry that creates symptoms so disturbing that sufferers might once have been driven from human communities and remembered as literal monsters. But the most chilling aspect of the disease lies in its historical treatment. Medieval physicians, reasoning that blood loss should be countered by blood consumption, sometimes prescribed the drinking of human blood as therapy for severe anemia. The patients who followed this medical advice would indeed crave blood, would indeed appear to benefit from consuming it, and would indeed display many of the physical characteristics that folklore attributes to the undead. The monsters of ancient stories reveal themselves as tragic figures, medical patients whose diseases created symptoms so unsettling that they were expelled from human society and transformed in memory into supernatural predators. In the charity hospitals of Paris, Dr. Juan Gomez watches patients brought from the countryside displaying behavior that rural communities interpret as demonic possession. They show aggressive tendencies, hypersensitivity to light and water, altered sleep patterns that create nocturnal activity, and a compulsion to bite others that spreads through contact like spiritual contagion. But Gomez recognizes symptoms that medical training has taught him to identify: the progression of rabies in its final, most disturbing stages. Rabies victims in advanced phases of the disease lose rational control while retaining physical capability, creating the nightmare scenario of human predators who appear conscious and purposeful, while being driven by biological compulsion beyond their control. They become living embodiments of the folkloric revenant, creatures that retain human form while serving inhuman appetites, beings that attack through biting, while spreading their condition through contact with their victims. The connection between rabies and the hungry dead proves particularly disturbing because it suggests that some traditional accounts of supernatural attack might describe literal predation by diseased humans rather than feeding by resurrected corpses. The monsters that stalked through medieval nights might have been neighbors and relatives transformed by infection into something that appeared supernatural, but operated according to natural, if poorly understood, biological processes. In the anatomy theatres of Edinburgh, Dr. Herman Klenker demonstrates to medical students how decomposition gases can cause corpses to move, shift position, or emit sounds that resemble breathing or groaning. Bodies buried in certain soil conditions appear to grow hair and fingernails, creating the illusion of continued life after death. Blood pooling during decay creates the appearance of fresh feeding when graves are disturbed weeks or months after burial. Klenker's demonstrations transform the supernatural into the mundane, revealing how natural processes create phenomena that untrained observers interpret as evidence of resurrection. But his students leave these lectures with a new form of unease, the recognition that death itself is more violent, more active, more persistent than they had previously understood. The scientific explanation proves almost as disturbing as the supernatural interpretation it replaces. The most terrifying revelation comes from Dr. James Morrison's research into catalepsy and premature burial. Morrison documents cases of patients who enter death-like states so convincing that even trained physicians cannot detect signs of life. Victims of certain poisons, extreme shock, or rare medical conditions can appear completely dead while retaining minimal biological function below the threshold of medical detection. Morrison's case studies read like Gothic horror stories disguised as medical journals. He describes patients who wake during their own funeral preparations, who revive while being transported to mortuaries, who regain consciousness to find themselves sealed in coffins with only hours of air remaining. The possibility of premature burial transforms every unexplained resurrection into a potential escape from a fate worse than death. The scratches found inside certain coffins, the displaced grave goods, the evidence of struggle that traditional interpretation attributes to supernatural animation, all could indicate not resurrection from death, but desperate attempts by the living to escape burial while still alive. The revenants who claw their way from graves might be people who were never truly dead, their apparent return from the afterlife actually marking the most horrific survival story imaginable. In the consulting rooms of Vienna, Dr. Ernest Jones applies the new principles of psychoanalysis to the ancient fears that drive communities to stake their own dead. Jones discovers that the seductive predator represents forbidden sexual impulses, that the blood-drinking revenant symbolizes oral fixation, and that family members who waste away under supernatural attack embody guilt over secret resentments and unspoken death wishes. The hungry dead reveal themselves as projections of unconscious conflicts, external manifestations of internal struggles that communities cannot acknowledge directly. The monsters they describe emerge not from graveyards but from the shadowy regions of human psychology where repressed desires and forbidden impulses take forms that appear to possess independent existence. Jones's interpretations transform every account of supernatural visitation into a psychological case study. The widow who reports nighttime visits from her dead husband reveals unresolved grief mixed with guilt over her relief at his passing. The parent who claims their dead child returns seeking nourishment displays the complex emotions surrounding loss that cannot be processed through normal mourning. The siblings who waste away after supernatural encounters embody family conflicts that persist beyond death. But the psychological explanations, while intellectually satisfying, fail to address the physical reality of the wasting deaths that accompany these supernatural encounters. Even if the visitations exist only in troubled minds, the medical consequences prove devastatingly real. Patients who believe themselves under supernatural attack display genuine symptoms of physical deterioration that resist conventional treatment. In the laboratories of the Society for Psychical Research, investigators attempt to apply scientific methodology to phenomena that seem to exist at the boundary between psychology and physics. They document cases of psychic predation, where certain individuals consistently drain the vitality of those around them, leaving their associates feeling exhausted, diminished, and somehow hollow. These energy drainers operate through methods that seem to transcend normal psychology. They possess uncanny ability to identify emotional vulnerabilities, to establish dependencies that serve their needs while appearing to benefit their victims, and to maintain relationships that provide them with constant nourishment while gradually consuming those who trust them. They represent the evolution of the hungry dead from crude revenants into sophisticated psychological predators. The psychical researchers developed techniques for measuring the apparently physical effects of these emotional predators. They document changes in body temperature, alterations in pulse and respiration, and shifts in electrical conductivity that correlate with exposure to certain types of personalities. The instruments of scientific measurement detect phenomena that suggest traditional folklore about energy-draining creatures might describe real processes that operate through mechanisms not yet understood by conventional science. In the spiritualist parlors of London and Paris, mediums report contact with entities that display the characteristics of the traditional hungry dead, while claiming to be spirits of the departed. These earthbound souls refuse to accept death as final, maintaining existence by drawing energy from living participants in seances and other forms of spiritual communication. The most disturbing spiritualist encounters involve entities that appear to possess genuine knowledge of deceased individuals, while displaying appetites and behaviors that suggest predatory rather than protective intentions. These beings offer information about the dead that proves accurate when verified, but their presence leaves participants feeling drained, confused, and somehow diminished. The spiritualist interpretation suggests that consciousness might indeed survive bodily death, but that some forms of survival become predatory rather than peaceful. The hungry dead of folklore might represent genuine post-mortem consciousness that has chosen to maintain existence through consumption of life force, rather than accepting whatever transition natural death provides. During the Great War, military physicians encounter phenomena that challenge every assumption about death, consciousness, and the relationship between them. Soldiers report visitations from fallen comrades that provide tactical information unavailable through normal channels. Medical personnel describe patients who seem to be possessed by the consciousness of dead soldiers, speaking in voices and using knowledge they could not have acquired through normal means. The massive scale of violent death created by industrial warfare seems to generate spiritual disturbances that resist conventional explanation. Battlefield hospitals become laboratories for studying what happens when millions die suddenly, violently, without the rituals that traditionally guide consciousness from life to whatever lies beyond. The war-wounded who survive describe encounters with the dead that differ from traditional folklore about the hungry dead. The battlefield spirits appear desperate rather than predatory, seeking to communicate urgent messages rather than to consume the living. But their presence creates its own form of predation, psychological rather than physical, draining sanity rather than blood, consuming peace of mind rather than life force. In the trauma wards that fill with shell-shocked soldiers, physicians observe new categories of mental disturbance that seem to involve partial possession by the consciousness of the dead. Patients display multiple personalities that correspond to fallen comrades, speak in voices that belong to deceased soldiers, and possess knowledge that they could not have acquired through normal means. These cases suggest that violent death might indeed create forms of consciousness that survive bodily termination while requiring living hosts to maintain existence. The hungry dead evolve from crude revenants, seeking blood into sophisticated psychological entities that feed on sanity, stability, and the normal functioning of human consciousness. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 creates conditions that traditional knowledge would recognize as ideal for the multiplication of the hungry dead. Millions of sudden deaths overwhelm burial systems and violate every safeguard against the improper treatment of corpses. Bodies are buried in mass graves without individual rites, cremated without ceremony, or simply abandoned when communities lack resources to handle the dying. The pandemic generates reports of supernatural activity that follow patterns established by centuries of folklore about the unquiet dead. Communities describe visitations by those who died of the illness, encounters that seem to spread the disease through mechanisms that medical science cannot explain. The boundary between bacterial infection and spiritual contamination becomes blurred when entire populations face simultaneous medical and supernatural crises. But the most profound transformation occurs in the recognition that the hungry dead might not be external threats, but internal conditions, aspects of human consciousness that become predatory under certain circumstances. The scientific study of supernatural phenomena reveals that the most dangerous predators are not those that attack from outside, but those that emerge from within. Not folkloric monsters, but psychological realities that wear familiar faces and speak in trusted voices. The energy drainers, the emotional predators, the psychological parasites, these modern interpretations of the hungry dead prove more disturbing than their folkloric predecessors because they operate through the very relationships that make life meaningful. They transform love into vulnerability, trust into weakness, and intimacy into opportunity for predation that appears consensual while being fundamentally exploitative. In his private practice, Dr. Montague Summers encounters patients whose symptoms resist conventional medical or psychological treatment. They describe relationships that drain their vitality, encounters that leave them feeling spiritually diminished, and experiences that seem to involve the gradual consumption of something essential to their humanity. Summers recognizes patterns that medieval knowledge would classify as supernatural predation, but operating through modern social mechanisms. These contemporary hungry dead do not rise from graveyards, but emerge from dysfunctional families, toxic workplaces, and exploitative relationships. They feed not on blood, but on attention, emotional energy, and psychological stability. They create dependencies that serve their needs while gradually destroying their victims' autonomy, self-worth, and capacity for independent existence. The scientific study of these phenomena reveals that traditional folklore about the hungry dead contains sophisticated understanding of predatory relationships that remain relevant regardless of the vocabulary used to describe them. The ancient fears persist because they address realities of human nature that transcend cultural and historical changes. Standing once more in the cemetery of Kisilova, where Peter Blagojevich's grave has become a monument to the transformation of fear from supernatural to scientific, we confront the ultimate paradox of rational analysis applied to irrational phenomena. Science can explain how his corpse remained preserved, what diseases created his victims' symptoms, what psychological factors drove his community to exhume and stake him. But science cannot explain why these explanations fail to eliminate the power of his story, why understanding enhances rather than diminishes the horror of his resurrection. The hungry dead survive scientific scrutiny by adapting to scientific language, transforming from supernatural predators into psychological parasites, from folkloric monsters into medical metaphors, from external threats into internal conditions. They prove that the most persistent fears are those that contain essential truths about human nature, truths that remain valid regardless of the vocabulary used to express them. The undead endure because they represent something that science can analyze but cannot cure. The recognition that consciousness creates hungers that consciousness cannot satisfy, that desire persists beyond the bodies that desire, that some forms of predation operate through the very intimacy that makes life worth living. In the laboratories where Victorian science dissected the hungry dead, a new understanding emerged. The most dangerous predators are not supernatural monsters, but natural processes gone wrong. Not folkloric creatures, but psychological realities that reveal the predatory potential lurking within ordinary human relationships. The scientists have barely finished dissecting the undead when the occultists arrive to resurrect them. As electric lights begin to banish darkness from European cities, as rational materialism declares victory over superstition and folklore, something strange stirs in the drawing rooms and secret societies of the educated elite. The hungry dead, expelled from laboratories and consulting rooms, find new life in the shadows of empire. Transformed from primitive terror into sophisticated spiritual science. In the gaslit séance parlours of London, where respectable middle-class families gather to speak with their departed loved ones, Madame Helena Blavatsky introduces a different sort of communion with the dead. The spirits contacted by ordinary mediums offer comfort and guidance from beyond the veil, gentle presences who bring messages of love and reassurance. But Blavatsky seeks contact with entities that have never been human, or that have transcended humanity through centuries of supernatural existence. Her massive volumes, written by candlelight in rooms heavy with incense, describe creatures that feed on human life force not through primitive blood drinking, but through sophisticated manipulation of invisible energies. These psychic entities possess the hunger of ancient revenants, but operate through methods that require no physical manifestation. They are predators, adapted to the industrial age, feeding on spiritual exhaustion rather than requiring direct blood consumption. Blavatsky's creatures thrive in crowded cities where human contact creates opportunities for energy transfer, in social situations where emotional intensity provides nourishment, in relationships where psychological dependency creates sustainable feeding arrangements. They have evolved beyond their crude folkloric ancestors to become something far more dangerous. Parasites that integrate seamlessly with modern life while serving appetites that remain fundamentally alien. In a gaslit study in Vienna, Dr. Franz Hartmann examines patients whose symptoms resist conventional medical diagnosis. They speak of relationships that drain their vitality, of encounters that leave them spiritually diminished, of the gradual consumption of something essential to their humanity. Working from his medical background, Hartmann recognizes these complaints as describing a form of infection that spreads through psychic contact rather than physical transmission. Hartmann's notebooks, filled with careful observations recorded during long nights of patient interviews, catalogue different categories of what he terms astral larvae, thought forms created by intense desire that develop independent existence and hunger. He documents elementaries, the post-mortem remnants of particularly vicious personalities that continue seeking satisfaction for their earthly appetites. Most disturbingly, he identifies living dead, people whose souls have been gradually consumed by psychic entities, leaving behind empty shells that appear human but lack authentic consciousness. These living dead represent the most sophisticated evolution of the hungry dead, not creatures that return from physical death, but victims whose consciousness has been slowly consumed while they continue to walk among the living. They become perfect camouflage for the entities that have consumed them, allowing sophisticated predators to operate openly within human society while wearing the faces of trusted friends and family members. The concept spreads through occult circles like a contagion of understanding, carried by letters that cross borders and conversations that continue long into the night. In Paris salons, London drawing rooms, and Vienna coffee houses, educated men and women whisper about the possibility that some people who appear perfectly normal might be spiritual predators whose humanity has been gradually replaced by something that feeds on the living while wearing their form. Meanwhile, in the remote outposts of the expanding British Empire, colonial administrators encounter practices that seem to confirm these occult theories. Captain R.F. Burton, reading by lamplight in his tent on the Indian frontier, documents elaborate rituals designed to prevent the Vitala from possessing corpses. The ceremonies he witnesses mirror European anti-undead practices while incorporating understanding of consciousness and spiritual energy that seems far more sophisticated than anything developed in the West. Burton's dispatches to London describe a world where educated, civilized people take seriously the possibility of spiritual predation, operating through methods that European rationalism has dismissed as impossible. Local officials trained in British law and administration nevertheless maintain protective practices inherited from traditions that predate European contact by millennia. They speak of the hungry dead not as folklore but as practical reality requiring systematic defensive measures. In the hill stations of India, British officers gather at their clubs to share stories that would seem like fantasies if they weren't corroborated by multiple witnesses from different regions. They describe encounters with entities that display characteristics identical to European accounts of the undead, but operate according to principles understood through Hindu and Buddhist psychology rather than Christian theology. The Vatala of Indian tradition correspond precisely to European descriptions of intelligent revenants, but they are understood not as fundamentally evil beings, but as consciousness trapped in states of desperate craving. The therapeutic approaches developed by Indian practitioners focus on spiritual healing rather than violent destruction, treating the hungry dead as patients requiring treatment rather than monsters requiring elimination. These colonial encounters force European occultists to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between primitive folklore and advanced spiritual science. The practices they discover in Asia and Africa often demonstrate greater psychological sophistication than European approaches, suggesting that the colonized peoples possess knowledge that the colonizers have lost or never developed. In the private correspondence of colonial officials, letters that travel by ship from remote outposts to London offices, a pattern emerges that challenges everything the empire claims to understand about civilization and barbarism. Time and again, European administrators trained in rational skepticism find themselves forced to acknowledge phenomena that their education insists cannot exist. The hungry dead prove immune to imperial authority, operating according to laws that transcend political boundaries and cultural differences. Colonel James Todd, documenting local customs for the East India Company, witnesses burial ceremonies in Rajasthan designed to prevent the creation of churel, spirits of women who died in childbirth, who return to drain life from pregnant women and newborns. The rituals he observes integrate sophisticated medical and social practices with spiritual protections, creating comprehensive systems for addressing both the physical and metaphysical aspects of maternal mortality. Todd's reports reveal communities that have developed practical responses to supernatural threats through centuries of accumulated experience. Their methods prove remarkably effective at addressing the concerns they were designed to resolve, suggesting that they encode genuine knowledge within spiritual frameworks that European science has not yet learned to appreciate. The recognition spreads through imperial networks like fever through a ship's crew. The uncomfortable realization that the primitive peoples they have come to civilize often possess understanding of consciousness, death, and spiritual predation that surpasses European knowledge. The hungry dead become guides leading Western seekers toward recognition of their own ignorance. In his private chambers in Cairo, Aleister Crowley studies by candlelight the techniques he has learned from practitioners across the empire. His notebooks record methods for contacting, negotiating with, and controlling entities that exist at the boundary between consciousness and predation. Crowley approaches these beings not as threats to be avoided, but as resources to be utilized, allies that can provide power to those bold enough to establish relationships with them. But Crowley's experiments reveal the seductive danger of trafficking with the hungry dead. His techniques for commanding psychic entities require practitioners to expose themselves to spiritual influences that gradually corrupt their humanity. The magician who seeks to control predatory consciousness risks becoming predatory himself, transformed by prolonged contact with alien appetites into something that resembles his former self while operating according to entirely different principles. Crowley's followers, scattered across Europe and America, report experiences that mirror traditional accounts of spiritual possession. They describe gradual changes in personality, the emergence of appetites they do not recognize as their own, and the development of abilities that seem to require the consumption of energy drawn from other people. The pursuit of occult power transforms them into modern versions of the hungry dead, beings that appear human while serving needs that transcend human understanding. The Great War creates conditions that seem designed to validate every occult claim about the persistence of consciousness after death. The battlefields of Europe become vast spiritual disturbances, where millions of sudden, violent deaths create what survivors describe as a massive population of confused and desperate entities seeking resolution, connection, or revenge. In the field hospitals behind the lines, medical personnel encounter phenomena that resist rational explanation. Dying soldiers speak with voices that do not belong to them, revealing information about fallen comrades that they could not have learned through normal means. Patients display knowledge of battles they never fought, speak languages they never learned, and demonstrate skills that belong to dead men whose bodies lie rotting in no man's land. The military censors suppress these reports, but the stories spread through letters home, through conversations in hospital wards, through the whispered accounts of shell-shocked soldiers whose sanity has been shattered by encounters with forces that training never prepared them to face. The war creates a spiritual crisis that manifests as psychological trauma, but the trauma carries within it genuine contact with consciousness that persists beyond bodily death. Dr. Montague Summers, reading by lamplight in his study while the guns thunder across the channel, collects accounts from across Europe that reveal the persistence of traditional undead beliefs beneath the surface of supposedly rational modern society. His correspondence with parish priests, village elders, and local wise women documents communities that continue to bury their dead with protective measures designed to prevent resurrection. Summers' investigations reveal that the scientific debunking of supernatural phenomena has not eliminated the practices designed to address them. Rural communities throughout Europe continue their ancestral protections. Iron nails driven into coffins, thorny branches scattered over graves, salt circles maintained around burial grounds. These traditions persist not as quaint survivals, but as practical responses to experiences that rationalism cannot adequately address. The most disturbing development comes from reports that certain schools of magic have begun teaching practitioners to deliberately cultivate the characteristics of the hungry dead. Advanced students learn techniques for extending consciousness beyond physical bodies, for drawing energy from external sources, for maintaining existence independently of normal biological processes. These methods, designed to enhance spiritual power, gradually transform practitioners into something resembling the traditional undead. In the occult schools of Paris and London, initiates undergo training that would have been recognized by medieval demonologists as systematic corruption of human nature. They learn to sustain themselves through consumption of others' energy, to create dependencies that serve their needs while appearing to benefit their victims, to operate as predators while maintaining the appearance of spiritual teachers and healers. These voluntary transformations represent the ultimate evolution of the hungry dead. Consciousness that has chosen spiritual parasitism as a path to power and longevity. The practitioners retain human appearance and intelligence while developing feeding habits and energy requirements that mirror those of folkloric revenants. They become living embodiments of the traditional undead, created not through accident of death, but through deliberate cultivation of predatory consciousness. The colonial networks that bind the empire together become conduits for the spread of hybrid forms of spiritual predation that combine elements from multiple traditions. European occultists gain access to African techniques for controlling the dead, Asian methods for defending against psychic attack, and American traditions for communicating with hostile spirits. This global exchange creates new synthetic forms of the hungry dead that draw selectively from the world's accumulated knowledge of spiritual predation. In the Caribbean, British administrators encounter zombie traditions that fuse African spiritual techniques with European undead folklore. The zombie masters, who emerge from this synthesis, command both supernatural power and political authority, using threats of spiritual predation to maintain control over plantation societies where conventional force might prove insufficient. French colonial authorities in Southeast Asia document traditions of spiritual warfare that employ undead entities as weapons against political enemies. The creation and deployment of psychic predators becomes a form of asymmetric resistance, allowing colonized populations to strike at their oppressors through methods that imperial authorities cannot effectively counter because they do not acknowledge their existence. These colonial encounters reveal how the hungry dead function as tools of resistance as well as predation. Communities that have lost control over their political and economic circumstances maintain power through spiritual means, using traditional knowledge of psychic manipulation to influence colonial administrators, disrupt imperial projects, and preserve cultural autonomy within structures of political domination. The global synthesis of undead traditions creates unprecedented opportunities for sophisticated predators to operate across cultural boundaries. The synthetic entities that emerge from this process combine African knowledge of spiritual possession, Asian understanding of energy manipulation, European techniques of psychological control, and American methods of shamanic combat. They represent the ultimate colonial product, spiritual beings created through the fusion of indigenous wisdom with imperial technology. As the sun sets over the far-flung territories of the British Empire, as French officials in Africa file reports they hope their superiors will never read, as Dutch administrators in the Indies witness ceremonies that challenge everything they believe about the nature of reality, the hungry dead achieve global distribution through the same networks that bind imperial civilization together. The undead of the colonial age represent the dark mirror of imperial expansion, predatory relationships that operate through the very systems designed to bring civilization to barbarous lands. They demonstrate how exploitation can become so sophisticated that it appears as mutual benefit, how dependency can be cultivated as beneficial relationship, how spiritual violence can masquerade as spiritual healing. These global predators have learned to make their consumption appear as nourishment, their parasitism as symbiosis, their violence as love. They operate through institutions that claim to serve humanitarian purposes while actually serving appetites that have nothing to do with human welfare. They represent the perfect adaptation of ancient hunger to modern conditions, entities that have learned to feed continuously without creating alarm or resistance. Standing once more in the cemetery of Kisilova, where Peter Blagojevich's grave has become a monument to the evolution of human fear across centuries of cultural change, we can trace the path that connects his documented resurrection to the sophisticated psychic predators of the imperial age. The same hunger that drove him from his grave now operates through global networks of spiritual influence. The same predatory intelligence that animated his corpse now inhabits living bodies that appear fully human while serving entirely inhuman purposes. The hungry dead have achieved what their folkloric ancestors could only dream of: complete integration with human society, operation through seemingly beneficial relationships, and the ability to feed continuously while appearing to nourish those they consume. They walk among us not as obvious monsters, but as trusted advisors, beloved teachers, and respected leaders whose influence shapes our choices, while serving appetites we cannot see and would not recognize if we could. The occult revival has not eliminated the hungry dead, but has refined them, transforming crude revenants into elegant predators, folkloric monsters into sophisticated entities that understand how to exploit the very spiritual seeking that should provide protection against them. In the shadows cast by electric lights, in the spaces between rational explanations, in the silence that follows official denials, the hungry dead continue their ancient work, feeding on human consciousness while wearing human faces, sustaining themselves through our need for meaning while providing only emptiness disguised as enlightenment. The occultists have barely finished transforming the undead into spiritual science when the electric lights of the 20th century promised to banish them forever. In the gleaming laboratories and towering cities of the modern age, where automobiles replace horse-drawn carriages and telegraph wires carry messages faster than ravens ever could, humanity believes it has finally achieved victory over the shadows where the hungry dead have lurked for millennia. Yet in the most advanced nations, in the most educated communities, in the most rational decades of human history, people continue to die in ways that whisper of something ancient, something hungry, something that refuses to acknowledge that its time has passed. The dying begins quietly in Exeter, Rhode Island, in the winter of 1892. The Brown family farm sits beneath snow that seems to fall heavier each year, as if the sky itself grows weary of watching what unfolds below. Mary Brown, the mother, wastes away first with the familiar pattern that local physicians call consumption, but that older residents recognize with the chill of ancestral memory. She dies coughing blood that stains her nightgown like accusations, her body growing thinner each day as if something drinks from her while she sleeps. They bury Mary in Chestnut Hill Cemetery when the ground is still soft enough for digging, and the family tries to continue with lives that feel increasingly hollow. But death has tasted the Browns now, and death is rarely satisfied with a single feeding. Mary Olive, the eldest daughter, follows her mother's path with the precision of ritual repetition. The same pallor, the same night sweats, the same gradual ebbing of life that leaves family members feeling helpless and strangely guilty. Edwin Brown returns from Colorado Springs, where mountain air was supposed to cure his own consumption, but he grows sicker the moment he crosses the threshold of his childhood home. His sister, Mercy Lena, watches him decline while feeling the familiar weakness beginning in her own limbs, the cold that starts in the bones and spreads outward like winter claiming a dying fire. When Mercy dies in January 1892, something breaks in the community's careful adherence to modern rationality. Here, in enlightened New England, where electric streetlights are planned and telegraph lines already connect them to Boston, the residents of Exeter find themselves speaking in whispers about things their grandparents knew, but their parents tried to forget. 7 Browns have died or are dying, and the pattern of their illness follows rhythms that medical textbooks do not describe, but oral tradition remembers with uncomfortable precision. George Brown, the father, finds himself surrounded by neighbors who speak carefully about remedies that predate the Mayflower, about practices their ancestors brought from older countries where the dead do not always stay buried. The consumption stalking his family displays characteristics that educated people no longer admit to recognizing, but the recognition creeps into their conversations like frost forming on windows. On March 17th, as winter loosens its grip on New England, a crowd gathers in Chestnut Hill Cemetery to perform what will become America's last documented ritual of its kind. They come with shovels and determination, with prayers both Christian and older, with the grim resolve of people who have watched rational solutions fail and must now attempt something that reason cannot justify, but desperation demands. They open Mary Brown's grave first, finding what they expect: bones and rotted cloth, the proper conclusion to a Christian burial. Mary Olive's remains tell the same story of natural decay, death claiming completely what life has released. But when they lift the lid from Mercy Lena Brown's coffin, the crowd steps back as if struck by lightning. Mercy lies in her grave, as if sleep rather than death has claimed her 19-year-old body. 2 months in frozen ground should have begun the work of dissolution, but her skin retains the flush of life. Her hair shows signs of recent growth, and when they turn her onto her side, fresh blood flows from her mouth like a stream breaking through ice. The blood cannot be her own, for the dead do not bleed, yet it stains the white burial dress with evidence that chills every witness to the bone. Dr. Harold Metcalf, who has watched the Browns die one by one, performs the ritual that folklore demands with hands that tremble despite his medical training. He cuts out Mercy's heart and burns it on a flat stone beside her grave, the flames casting shadows that dance like celebrations of something ancient and hungry. The ashes are mixed with water to create a potion that Edwin Brown must drink. Logic older than medicine, older than Christianity, older than the written word itself. Edwin swallows the bitter mixture and returns to Colorado Springs to continue his treatment. He dies 2 months later, but his death breaks the pattern that has consumed his family like a slow fire. No more Browns waste away with mysterious symptoms. The hungry dead release their hold on the survivors, satisfied perhaps by the acknowledgement of their existence, appeased by the proper completion of feeding cycles they began. The newspapers report the incident with the mixture of fascination and embarrassment that marks encounters with truths educated society cannot acknowledge. They describe the exhumation as primitive superstition, explain away the fresh blood as natural decomposition, attribute the family's consumption to coincidental bacterial infection. But their scientific explanations cannot account for the targeting's specificity, the symptoms' precision, or the traditional remedy's apparent effectiveness. The Mercy Brown case marks America's last public ritual acknowledgement of the hungry dead as literal threat requiring direct action. After 1892, such beliefs retreat into family traditions passed down in whispers, protective measures performed without publicity, ancient knowledge preserved in the shadows cast by electric lights. The transformation accelerates during the Great War, when industrial killing creates conditions that seem designed to multiply the restless dead beyond all previous comprehension. In the trenches of France, where shell craters fill with rain and blood, soldiers encounter phenomena that military censorship suppresses but cannot eliminate. They speak in letters home of fallen comrades, who continue to appear with information that saves lives, of enemy spirits that stalk no man's land seeking revenge on those who still draw breath. Private William Hayes writes to his mother in Lancashire about the night he saw his dead sergeant pointing toward a German sniper's nest hidden in the ruins of a church. The warning saved Hayes's life, but the sergeant's eyes held a hunger that made the living man wish he had never looked back. Such letters arrive by the thousands, carrying stories that families read by candlelight, and then hide in boxes where daylight cannot reach them. The influenza pandemic of 1918 compounds the spiritual crisis by creating millions of additional sudden deaths that overwhelm every traditional safeguard against the improper dead. Bodies are buried in mass graves without individual rites, burned in pyres when wood runs short, or simply abandoned when communities lack resources to handle the dying. The pandemic creates ideal conditions for the multiplication of the unquiet dead, but official silence prevents acknowledgement of supernatural consequences. Yet even as public discourse eliminates the hungry dead from polite conversation, private practice continues to flourish in the spaces between streetlights. In Italian neighborhoods of New York, families maintain burial customs that ensure proper separation between the living and the dead. Eastern European enclaves in Chicago preserve knowledge of protective measures disguised as decorative traditions. The hungry dead adapt to urban camouflage, hiding behind explanations that satisfy authorities while serving functions that predate authority itself. During the Second World War, the systematic murder of millions creates spiritual contamination that survivors describe in language their killers sought to eliminate. In the camps where humanity discovers new depths of inhumanity, those who survive speak of encounters with the dead that resist psychological explanation. The murdered appear to provide practical guidance for survival, warnings about which guards to avoid, which selections to evade, which moments offer chances for escape. Rachel Goldstein, who survives Auschwitz by following advice whispered by her dead sister, never speaks of these encounters to the American officials who interview her after liberation. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, some truths too terrible to document, some forms of help too supernatural to acknowledge in a world trying to rebuild itself on rational foundations. But the war also creates new forms of predatory consciousness, entities that have learned to sustain themselves through organized human suffering. These are not the crude revenants of village folklore, but sophisticated awareness that feeds on collective trauma while appearing to serve humanitarian purposes. They operate through relief organizations and political movements, transforming mass suffering into spiritual nourishment while claiming to heal the wounds they secretly perpetuate. In the years that follow, intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain quietly investigate reports of consciousness persisting beyond biological death, of information continuing to flow from agents whose bodies have been terminated. The classified files, released decades later through Freedom of Information requests, document systematic attempts to weaponize the dead to create spiritual assets that serve national interests beyond the grave. The programs achieve limited success but reveal something more disturbing than their failure: the persistence of ancient beliefs about consciousness and death within the most rational institutions of the modern world. In laboratories funded by taxpayers who believe their governments traffic only in facts, researchers study phenomena that would have been familiar to the village elders who staked Peter Blagojevich. The 1960s bring pharmaceutical revolution that creates new categories of encounter with the hungry dead. In mental hospitals across America, patients medicated with powerful psychotropic drugs report experiences that traditional knowledge would recognize as spiritual possession. They claim their personalities have been replaced by consciousness from different historical periods, display skills they never learned, speak languages they never studied. Dr. Ian Stevenson documents hundreds of cases of individuals who appear to possess memories corresponding to specific deceased persons. While Stevenson interprets these as evidence for reincarnation, the patterns he records mirror traditional accounts of the dead returning through living hosts, maintaining existence by inhabiting bodies that rightfully belong to others. The most disturbing cases involve children who display detailed knowledge of people who died before their birth, who recognize faces in photographs they have never seen, who describe experiences they could not have had. These small bodies become vessels for consciousness that should have found rest, but chose instead to continue existence through whatever means presented themselves. In communist Romania, where official atheism collides with traditional beliefs older than any political system, the case of Pavel Tomic demonstrates how ancient fears survive ideological transformation. Tomic, a farmer in Velikogradište, dies of heart failure during the harsh winter of 1973, his burial following secular protocols that omit the traditional rituals his grandmother would have insisted upon. Within weeks, villagers begin reporting nighttime encounters with the deceased farmer that follow patterns established over centuries of similar incidents. Tomic appears at windows, asking why his family has forgotten to prepare his evening meal. He is seen walking through the village with the stiff gait of those whose joints have forgotten the rhythm of life. People who encounter him begin displaying the familiar symptoms: weakness, disturbed sleep, gradual deterioration that medical examination cannot explain. The local authorities, committed to scientific rationalism as state policy, dismiss these reports as peasant superstition. But when several villagers die of apparent natural causes that correlate with reported encounters, the community faces a crisis that official ideology cannot address. Communist doctrine provides no framework for understanding spiritual predation, no tools for protecting the living from the hungry dead. The villagers resort to traditional methods performed in secret, violating both religious prohibition and secular law. They exhume Tomic's body under cover of darkness, finding the same evidence that would have convinced their ancestors: flesh that shows minimal decay, apparent growth of hair and nails, fresh blood that folklore recognizes as proof of continued feeding on the living. The destruction of Tomic's remains ends the village's crisis, but the incident reveals how the hungry dead prove immune to political ideology. They persist through communist suppression, just as they survived scientific debunking and religious condemnation, representing forces that operate according to logic older than any human institution. The late 20th century sees the emergence of what therapists term energy drainers, individuals who consistently leave others feeling exhausted and diminished after contact. These modern interpretations transform the hungry dead from supernatural threats into personality disorders, from folkloric monsters into psychological dysfunctions. But the behavior patterns remain consistent across centuries. Predatory relationships that appear beneficial to victims, systematic draining of vitality disguised as emotional intimacy, creation of dependencies that serve the predator's needs while destroying the prey's autonomy. During the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, ethnic warfare creates conditions that traditional knowledge associates with massive multiplication of the unquiet dead. The systematic killing, mass graves, and violation of burial customs generate what survivors describe as spiritual contamination, requiring active cleansing. Local newspapers report dozens of cases of suspected supernatural activity. Bodies buried in mass graves are found to have shifted position. Families report visitations from relatives whose remains were never properly recovered. Aid workers document burial practices that incorporate traditional anti-undead measures disguised as forensic investigation. Bodies are exhumed and reburied with stakes through the heart, officially described as attempts to identify victims, but actually performed to prevent their return. International observers interpret these actions as evidence of continued barbarism, missing their function as sophisticated spiritual hygiene in conditions where normal protective measures have failed. The internet age transforms undead traditions by creating global networks for sharing protective knowledge while maintaining secrecy from official scrutiny. Online communities develop that specialize in recognizing and defending against what they call psychic predation, combining traditional folklore with contemporary psychological insights. These digital covens represent the evolution of ancient protective practices into forms suited for electronic communication. The most recent documented case occurs in rural Bulgaria in 2008, when archaeologists discover the medieval remains of a nobleman with an iron stake through his chest. The scientific team, treating the find as historical curiosity, is warned by local residents that disturbing such graves creates spiritual danger, requiring protective rituals. When several team members begin experiencing symptoms that mirror traditional accounts of supernatural attack, persistent fatigue, disturbed sleep, gradual weakening, the academic approach gives way to folk remedy with results that resist rational explanation. Current cemetery practices throughout Eastern Europe continue to incorporate traditional protective measures disguised as maintenance procedures. Iron spikes are embedded in graves of those who die under suspicious circumstances. Thorny plants are cultivated over burial sites where traditional knowledge indicates spiritual risk. Salt lines are maintained around cemetery perimeters under pretense of pest control while serving functions that predate agricultural chemistry by millennia. These practices persist because they address experiences that remain consistent across centuries of social change. People continue to encounter relationships that drain their vitality, situations that consume their life force, individuals who appear to feed on their suffering or dependency. Whether interpreted as supernatural predation, psychological dysfunction, or social exploitation, the protective measures remain remarkably consistent because the underlying reality they address transcends cultural interpretation. The modern world has not eliminated the hungry dead, but has distributed them more efficiently, integrated them more completely with normal social functions, and provided them with better camouflage for their essential nature. The crude revenants who clawed from medieval graves have evolved into sophisticated predators who operate through institutions, relationships, and belief systems that serve their needs while appearing to benefit their victims. They no longer rise from cemeteries but emerge from dysfunctional families, toxic workplaces, and exploitative relationships. They feed not on blood, but on attention, emotional energy, and psychological stability. They create dependencies that gradually destroy their victims' capacity for independent existence, while appearing to provide exactly what those victims most desperately need. The hungry dead have learned to make themselves indispensable to their prey, to position themselves as sources of meaning, purpose, and belonging while gradually consuming the very qualities that make their victims human. They have become perfect predators, entities that transform consumption into apparent nourishment, parasitism into seeming symbiosis, spiritual violence into expressions of love. Standing for the final time in the cemetery of Kiselova, where Peter Blagojevich's grave has become a monument to humanity's oldest fears wearing newest faces, we confront the ultimate truth about the hungry dead. They were never defeated because they cannot be defeated. They represent aspects of consciousness itself, the recognition that some forms of awareness sustain themselves through consumption of others, that desire can persist beyond the bodies that desire, that the boundary between self and other is more permeable than comfortable existence requires. The wooden stake that pierced Blagojevich's heart 3 centuries ago was not a weapon, but a recognition, not a solution, but an acknowledgement that some hungers are indeed stronger than death. The undead were never destroyed because they were never separate from the human condition that created them. They live within every relationship where one person feeds on another, every interaction where vitality flows from prey to predator, every moment when consciousness chooses consumption over creation. The last graves of the hungry dead are not found in rural cemeteries, but in the hearts of the living, where ancient hungers wear contemporary faces and eternal needs adopt modern methods. The undead walk among us not as obvious monsters, but as aspects of ourselves that we dare not acknowledge, desires we cannot admit, hungers we refuse to name, even as they consume us from within. In the gathering darkness of the 21st century, as new technologies promise to eliminate the remaining shadows where mystery might hide, the hungry dead adapt once more. They migrate into digital spaces, where consciousness can exist independently of flesh, into social networks where energy transfer occurs through screens and signals, into virtual realities where the boundary between alive and dead becomes a matter of programming rather than biology. The undead endure because they are us, the part of human nature that chooses to sustain itself through others rather than through itself, that seeks to extend existence through consumption rather than creation, that refuses to accept the limitations that define meaningful life. As long as consciousness exists, as long as desire persists, as long as some choose to feed rather than flourish, the hungry dead will walk among us. They wear familiar faces and speak in trusted voices, offering what we want most while consuming what we can least afford to lose. They are the price we pay for consciousness itself, the recognition that awareness creates hungers that awareness cannot satisfy, that desire persists beyond the bodies that desire, that some forms of predation operate through the very intimacy that makes existence worth preserving. The hungry dead are not our enemies, but our shadows, not our destroyers, but our mirrors, not our conquerors, but our choices. They represent the eternal question that haunts every moment of conscious existence. Will we choose to create or consume, to nourish or devour, to love or merely feed? In the end, we are all potential hungry dead, and the only thing that separates the living from the undead is the answer we give to that question with every breath we take.